With me and from around the country beaming into this webinar are some of Gordon's closest confidants and greatest advocates, each of whom has a special perspective or vantage point onto his world. He was a very special person to everyone on the panel today, and I'm very grateful for their time and permission, especially given how raw it is still to be talking without him since his passing on the 3rd of June in 2014. It's an irony not lost on a few of us that even if he were here, he'd probably elect not to be on camera today, especially if it meant he could stay in the studio and watch safely from a distance. So firstly, a big welcome to Leanne Bennett, who joins us in the studio today for what is Leanne's very first ever public program in Australia. Thank you. It's quite a privilege to be hearing from you as Gordon's partner, sounding board, and now as manager of the estate. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Tony Albert's online in Sydney. Over the past 10 years, Tony has achieved critical acclaim and a strong following for his visual arts practice, which often combines text, drawings, painting, video and sculpture. Examining the legacy of racial and cultural misrepresentation, particularly focused on Australia's Aboriginal people, he's developed a universal language that seeks to rewrite historical mistruths and injustices. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning. Hello.
Hello. Joining us from just up the river is Josh Milani. He's the director of Brisbane-based Milani Gallery, successor to Bellis Milani Gallery, which has become a mainstay of Australian commercial galleries dealing contemporary art. Having taken over from Peter Bellis, who was the first dealer in Australia to represent Gordon, Josh has expanded the gallery's roster and reach to now be one of only 2 dealers working with Leanne representing the estate, the other being Irene Sutton in Melbourne. Welcome to you, Josh. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
From Melbourne, Professor Ian Mclean is the Hugh Ramsey Chair of Australian Art History at the University of Melbourne. He's previously been a contemporary art scholar, researcher, and author based at the University of Wollongong and University of Western Australia. And he continues to publish extensively on Australian art and particularly on Indigenous art. His chapter as co-author of the artist's first monograph, titled The Art of Gordon Bennett in 1996, established Ian as one of the key voices in critical discussions of Australian art. And he's written on Bennett ever since, perhaps more than anybody else. Thanks for joining us, Ian. It's great to host you.
Thank you, Simon.
So in keeping with the basic parameters for our discussion today, I'd love to open with thoughts from Tony Albert. Tony, you're blazing a rather hot trail in the art world, and I think many people regard you as a bright prospect for the future of contemporary art in Australia. Perhaps, dare I say, as someone that would be an heir apparent to Gordon's trajectory. Certainly, as a First Nations artist entering mid-career, you do share some affinities. You've achieved great things early on. Your practice is concerned with how and why histories are written, who and why and what gets left out, and you often source and rearrange ready-made imagery which is loaded and ripe for reinterrogation. That's to say, you're also focused on the dynamics of Indigenous representations and the legacy of cultural identity to resist or shape wider nationalist agendas. I know many artists have cited Bennett as being an important figure to them. Folks like Judy Watson, Eugene Cocchesio, Dale Harding, Ryan Presley, even Warraba Weatherall. What is it in Gordon's practice that you resonate with as a maker? And how have you used that as inspiration or fuel or even as a point of departure?
Wow.
Yeah, sorry for the small question.
Thank you. Well, just to start, thank you, Lucinda, and yourself, Simon, for the acknowledgement. And I want to echo those sentiments. And I also want to congratulate and thank Leanne for, being on this panel and, through yourself and your daughter, that legacy continues through Gordon. So I acknowledge and thank that. And I'm so looking forward to your voice during this panel along with the other panelists. It was uncovering Gordon's work that I felt unalone in the world. And I think that's the key success to what Gordon has brought to, contemporary Australian art and indeed contemporary international art. I think for what he was doing at that time, it you know, there was so few role models attached to Indigenous excellence aside from maybe that on the sporting field. And when I was given this opportunity through amazing teacher to actually look at the work at Gordon, and it was really like, you know, someone had reached into my heart and showed me that everything that I was feeling, my thoughts about living and working in this country as an Aboriginal person became validated through his existence. And that's the strength that Gordon brought to, you know, this country, and as that kind of leader within that, and I acknowledge those on, you know, that paralleled his career. It was absolutely life-changing, and it would be wrong of me to say that that inspiration has not only continued through my practice, but that I'm actually here because of that legacy.
Wow.
Thank you.
Tony, you wrote a letter to Gordon once, and I know it really touched him in a way that no other young artist had managed to do at that time. What did you say in that letter, and what were you really hoping to achieve with it?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Josh for the generosity I received in Brisbane as a young artist. And I had been such, you know, so wanting to meet Gordon, but and we had met, I guess I didn't know him. And I was very aware through that Brisbane dynamic that, as you mentioned earlier, he was a bit of a recluse and didn't have openings, or wasn't the kind of, involved so much in the arts community as a lot of us were. And through Josh, I was, you know, able to really become closer to Gordon through just the generosity in being able to share his work. And he had showed me letters that Gordon had written to Jean-Michel Basquiat. And then they were, of course, posthumously written. And I didn't want to wait, you know, till later in my life or till after Gordon's passing to let him know what a significant effect he had on my life. And I wanted to be able to communicate with him in a way that I felt was respectful, also in his own sensitivities. And that's where, I guess, through his own inspiration in the way that he had written, that I felt, you know, compelled to write to him and just discuss issues that he was looking at that were affecting us as people. And, you know, I wish if I had the chance to be able to talk to him, these were the things I would like to say. And they manipulated themselves into an artwork in their own right. But again, I didn't want to release that to the public or feel that I had any ownership over those letters until Gordon had actually read them, and he had, you know, said to me, yes, this was actually okay for these to be distributed or shown within the public vernacular. So in a not so funny way, or in a way that is testament to the amazement of Gordon Bennett, it kind of, you know, stemmed from his idea. And you look within any mentorship, whether it's known or unknown throughout art history, those mimicking or replicating of ideas of your hero are quite common, if not part of the learning process. So that's where that actually came from, just reaching out to someone who I admired so significantly.
Just hearing that, it makes me think that actually letters and the idea of text as an artwork in itself started very early with Gordon. And in fact, I think he displayed a letter on the wall of the IMA as an artwork. And he was also interested in art correspondence. I think there's a work in your collection, Leanne, by Eugenio Ditborn, which is actually just letters, just text written by artists between each other. Tony, in our next edition of Artlines, another artist that you would know, Taloy Havini, she also talks about Bennett's legacy and, in a sense, how it kind of allowed her as a young Pacific Islander this opportunity to finally be able to relate to an artist who had shared experiences or challenges and observations she felt a great affinity with. And you've alluded to this, but in terms of heroes and role models, and it's a subject you revisit throughout your work in recognition that there are a lack of Black heroes, especially in mainstream views, for people of colour to identify, but also for non-Indigenous people to learn from. How important is it, and what does it mean for you that you and your peers have senior Black figures to reflect upon?
Well, it's beyond important. As I said, it was the vast, barren nature of the way in which Aboriginal people are reflected in society, particularly those who challenge that vernacular. You know, you're instantly silenced. And I mean, where I was coming from, that book that Gordon Bennett, and actually Ian Mclean, it was your book, you know, even the reading, the possibility to find or source things was really kind of impossible. I'm glad to see that is changing, but for that time period, and I think I said earlier, aside from those on the sporting field, that all those kind of people within academia, within the arts, I believe their voice was specifically silenced, and that's kind of you know, the power behind the work and this uncovering of heroes is that they exist. They've existed throughout history. You know, I was introduced to these people through oral storytelling, the way, you know, blackfellas communicate to each other, and that, you know, I tend to live my life through example. And, you know, if this can happen to me, I know it can happen to anyone. And, you know, that Gordon story was so replicative, just even in where we were living, I guess, that kind of inspiration. But the more access, you know, any of our youth have to kind of these, you know, wonderful people, the better. Yeah.
Indeed. So just quickly, looking at this whole idea of being cast by others as in some sort of relational dynamic, like say in the 60s when Joe Ruzzi was being referred to as the next Namatjira, or, you know, usually these days you get a sense every month or so when someone says so-and-so is going to be the next Emily. These kinds of observations usually get made by or throughout non-Indigenous commentary. What are some of the potential downsides of these sort of overly simplified associations?
Well, I guess the biggest one is that you're representative of a whole subculture of people. Our lives and existence are as equally different to anyone else's, and what happens 30 kilometers down the road in a different community, in a different set of people, there's different laws, different languages, different ways of interpreting things. So when you get these blanket platform ideas of who we are and what we represent, it does become quite nuanced, very difficult and blurred. And that's, I guess, one of the biggest challenges we face. However, one thing that unites us is, you know, I think through Gordon's work and understanding that, you know, as Aboriginal people, we still sit in the lowest common denominator of what is perceived as Australian society. And it's one of the fastest way you understand to fit in is to put yourself above that. And these are the, you know, the kind of things we talk about. So without trying to be a role model or a figure within that, I find just, you know, looking towards, you know, great mentors in my life that have done all this work with humility and with grace. And that's something that I try, you know, to replicate. We're standing in the footsteps of really great people who have led that pathway. Doors have opened for me because of what people like Gordon Bennett have done for us. And the acceptance and acknowledgement of that is so important. And I think just, you know, truth telling in its own right is, you know, the best way we can honor and keep that, I guess, flame alive in, you know, understanding what has come before us, and because of that, what we are able to do.
Indeed. Gordon used to speak about being really emotionally wrought or exhausted with the experience of continually having what he called a burden of representation thrust on him. it didn't sit comfortably with him being perceived as the go-to guy, or as you say, the spokesperson for for First Nations people. He railed against the idea of being forced into being this sort of foil for a usually non-Indigenous argument that he found banal or racist or disingenuous. In some ways, you really don't get to choose or influence all factors in the legacy algorithm, if you like. Things like who ends up championing you, or who openly has a crack at you, or how historians or writers insert you into certain contexts. What do you think of the notion that there is a burden of representation, put on you as a First Nations man, on top of what it is that you make and put into the public domain as an artist, which are conversation starters in their own right, right?
Absolutely. I must admit, like, I do struggle with that, that balance. And the interesting thing is, early in my career, I kind of wished Gordon was part of that public sphere, or involved in having a public role or representation. And the older I get as an artist, or the more I work within this field, the more I understand the want to stay away from all that. But to be honest, you just have to do what you do best. And I'm so grateful that, you know, it was Gordon's work that was his vessel for communicating those stories. And it really reminded me when you said he would have rather been sitting in the studio painting. You know, that's all he had to do, and that's all he did. And I'm so grateful for that.
Indeed. On your website, Tone, you speak about having a desire, or you talk about developing a universal language, seeking to rewrite historical mistruth and injustice. So there's obviously a real simpatico in that desire and that agency with Gordon's project. Can you tell us a bit about the purpose of speaking universally, and perhaps for the benefit of younger artists and a bit of free mentoring? How did you develop that language, and what would you view or detect its successes? How do you measure its success?
Mm-hmm. Another, a great question in terms of looking at Gordon's career and the influence it had on me. You do start local. You do start with that periphery in which you exist. And as I've grown as an artist and mimicked kind of that way in which, you know, Gordon's career projected as well, I had this opportunity to travel. I had this opportunity to look at bigger issues. And the more I did that, the greater the understanding was these conversations were global. They were about the periphery and the minority of society, but things were replicating, particularly as the world got smaller with technology, and this greater conversation emerged. And you know, I could see within Gordon's work the way he looked at issues like 9/11, with Islam, with things that, like, you know, the history of Australia really replicated that. There was the racism towards the Greek and the Italians very early on. Then it was the whole Chinese thing. And then 9/11, Muslims became the new enemy of the state. But underlining all that was still this lowest common denominator within Australia, which was Aboriginal people. And that's something that was never forgotten. But through teasing out that nuanced global international perspective, we understand that we are actually not alone in this. And I think it's a natural progression within art that, you know, my advice to young people is to stay local. Look, you know, tell those stories of who you are, your position, and on where you sit. And then it will be a natural progression to then grow from that. It's like saying you know, you don't draw you know, a stick figure to start with. You understand the whole autonomy of the body before, and then you go backwards from that. So I think it's having a real great sense of self, who you are and who you exist, and then branch out from that. But, you know, I definitely, again, mimicking my mentor in, you know, understanding and being at a privileged point in my career where I can look much further afield at what is happening in the world.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Tony. We're going to call back on you during the discussion, and conversely, feel free to break in whenever you feel like it. Leanne, as I mentioned, we had a really modest COVID-safe event last night, a sort of self-discovery tour for visitors to the show. What are your first impressions?
Before I start, thanks, Tony. That was lovely to hear how Gordon influenced your work. And yeah, thank you. Last night was a perfect opening for Gordon. There were no speeches, the lights were dim, there weren't many people there. The people who were there were people who wanted to come and look at the art. And it was just one big, you know, happy family, basically. I absolutely loved the show. When I was first approached by GOMA to perhaps, you know, look at doing an exhibition, it was always on my mind that it had to be different to what's been offered up before. And of course, Gordon was very fortunate in that he did have opportunities offered to him to be represented in state galleries and touring exhibitions, solo shows from an early time in his life, which started with the Leanne McGregor curated exhibition, which started in Brisbane and went to Birmingham and Norway. So this show needed to show the audience something different. And through close work with Zara, Stanhope and Abby, we were able to come up with what would you call it, like a formula to look at ways to look at Gordon's work in a different way. So this particular work, it has works on paper as its like beating heart, if you like, because with Gordon, most of his work started from drawings and drawings from the heart and notebooks. We never went to a gallery, international or local, without the notebook, even if it was just to sketch people in, you know, looking at other people's art. So all of those things became stimulus for what he put on canvas. So this show, as you walk through the show, it's not only sort of represented in a chronological way, but it also focuses on the various series. And some people have said to me, it's like walking into a group show because every series was different. And Gordon needed to remain fluid in that way so that he wasn't pinned down, he wasn't boxed in. And so the series began with, you know, self-reflection, and then it just became bigger and until it became difficult to do. Hence the Stripe series, where he decided to go quiet on the issues. So, but yeah.
You're happy with the show?
Yeah, I'm happy with the show.
Good one. All right, so let's go back in time from really very humble beginnings. You were at his side as awareness around the work and the practice really quickly took off, pretty much during his final year at the Queensland College of Art and right after he'd finished art school in '89 as a mature age student. I know Gordon was quite concerned about the ascendancy of that trajectory, and in a way it really started to fuel self-doubt right on the cusp of his sort of formation, if you like. Given that all of this attention has arrived so swiftly, and there were the usual sniping insinuations that he was jumping a bandwagon, hadn't done his time, wasn't authentic, wasn't a natural artist, and so on. What do you look back on as some of the seminal moments that cut through all of that stuff, where you can say Gordon began to believe in his own ability, had real agency, those moments that helped him see for himself that he was on a trajectory that would actually become really significant?
Simon, to answer that question, I really need to go back to when we first met.
Yeah, right.
It was never Gordon's intention to leave Year 10 education and become an artist. And it feels so surreal just sitting here looking at these magnificent paintings and thinking that this guy, he didn't want to be an artist when he was 15. He decided to be a tradesman, so he was a fitter and turner because his dad said, you know, stick with the trades, you'll always have employment. And that was obviously wasn't happy, and I was with him during those particular years. And then that then led on to, well, what else can I do? You know, I hate being working in a foundry. Let's pursue, you know, telecommunications, because, you know, that's what Dad did. And again, we got to like the 10-year anniversary, which was coming up to long service leave, and he couldn't get out quick enough. And it was really playing with his health. He didn't want to be thinking he was a young man, and this is what he was going to be doing until he retired at 60 or whatever the age would be. And so that then led on to pursuing courses in self-help. So with that gave him the confidence to think of what else he could do, have the confidence to resign from a government job, go to and do study perhaps full-time, and let's see where that develops. So the question was asked, well, what were you good at school? The answer was, well, you know, got a B in art and, you know, probably a B in English. And it's interesting now that it's those two subject areas that really are quite pronounced in his work, you know, that the use of text, the storytelling, not only visually, but in a written form. So with that, with sort of, okay, I'm going to pursue art. And then, of course, you know, how can you even apply to art college without any sort of portfolio? What do I show them? The you know, the Christmas cards I designed while I was, you know, in the drafting section at Telecom, when I was really trying to break out of that system. So that then led on to doing nighttime private part-time art courses to get a portfolio together. So off he went, luckily accepted into QCA in Brisbane, and basically started right from the start, you know, drawing, working with objects, looking at art history, all of these things that he had never even pursued in his life. We didn't go to art galleries, you know, we used to go to the beach. Gordon used to surf. Before that, he used to ride motorcycles. So, you know, an artist, my God, you know. So, but one subject at art college that really kind of played on him was the Aboriginal art and culture subject. And of course, anybody who goes through art college knows that at some point in that course, you have to become an artist and you have to focus on a particular topic. So he was aware of his Indigenous heritage, although it was kept very private. His mum preferred not to talk about it, and he did learn about his own heritage when he was only a young, teenager, 12, 13. When he was starting to notice physical features and noticing also some of the taunts that he was getting when he was working in a trade environment. So Gordon, at that time, he always struck me as this really happy, settled sort of a guy. I mean, that's why we were attracted. We were both those sort of people. But then as he became an artist, my God, he just turned into this, you know, self-reflecting and heavy going. It was very difficult to live with, might I say. Sorry, dear. But that subject just opened up so many doors for him. And so he then started to pursue things and then enjoyed reading. And so books like, you know, Blood on the Wattle gave him so much stimulus again, so much to work with to actually write, to paint pictures. So, and then he decided from reading a lot about how Indigenous people were portrayed, he thought, well, you know, that's not how I see it. So it was his aim to retell Australian history from an Indigenous Australian point of view.
You were also at his side whenever Gordon did attend one of his shows in Australia or abroad, and you witnessed moments where he had to deal with limelight or, you know, acclaim or even accept the odd award. How would you describe his early relationship with art world recognition and fame?
Not good.
Not good.
2 words, not good. Because he didn't think he deserved that sort of attention, I guess. again, because he came to art late, he was just painting what he had to get off his chest, basically. It was art therapy. So like every painting is a self-portrait. And so it tore him apart, really. It really did, you know, like, and he was a humble person. Like, people would just rave about his work and he would just say, I don't know what they're talking about. You know, that's not me. It must be someone else they're talking about.
He really did not have a conscious goal to be seen by others as an influencer or even have a legacy, right?
No, not at all. And then, and then, as you said before, you know, he sort of rose to fame early. And thanks to Peter Bellis, who, well, initially Mark Webb, who was one of his teachers at Queensland College of Art in the intermediate department, who saw a talent and who also showed with Peter Bellis. And then through introductions, Peter took Gordon on. And because of Peter's experience, was able to promote him. And consequently, then the exhibitions came and the offers came. And I remember he was selected for the Adelaide Biennial of Australian Art. Not 100% sure of the date. It's on his CV, if you just check his CV on Josh Milani's website. But at a sort of a social gathering afterwards, he was personally attacked by a woman who said that she couldn't deal with his art. And it was in relation to the artwork Outsider, which was his personal sort of discussion, I guess, with Vincent van Gogh. And it just sort of showed that he was this person who didn't belong to either camp. He was, you know, not here and he wasn't here. So he was in this middle section, and this woman just attacked him. And so from that point on, he thought, not physically, but, you know, verbally, and Gordon really took it to heart. I wasn't with him at the time in Adelaide, but he came home and he was feeling really quite down in that had happened. But then it made him realise that art does have an effect on people, and if that happened with one painting, then what were the possibilities of it happening with a range of the work? So that kind of gave him that steam to keep going. But I mean, it wasn't easy for him, because, you know, as he painted, it was like being whipped, if you like, you know, because he was telling these stories, and it hurt. It just really suffered. So after every painting, he would just have this sort of quiet time, you know, and as you know, like Gordon was a prolific painter. He would just get it all out there, and then he would just go quiet. And as Tony said, you know, he was a recluse. Like, he preferred to stay at home.
Yeah. Let's pick up on a couple of things there. There is a lot to understand in how Gordon referenced the work of other artists in his practice. But in his private life, Gordon drew quiet inspiration from mainly very discreet off-radar encounters where he was able to meet other artists. I recall him being really chuffed for weeks after spending just a few hours with Jimmy Dorham at Documenta in Germany. Or he just loved having Archie Roach and Ruby over for a barbecue. But who were some of the artists, or even, you mentioned Mark Webb and QCA, who were some of the artists and teachers, figures that he regarded as being really influential on his work and life very early? And what did they open up for him?
From the start, when you applied to go into an art college, knowing that you'd never done art in your life before, and when you resigned from your job and just waiting for that letter from the Brisbane Institutes to accept you into college, and when the first letter that you open is I'm sorry, thank you for your application, but I'm sorry, at this point in time your application has been unsuccessful. Then the second letter and the only other option you had, you open it and it was headed, you know, Queensland College of Art, and there's congratulations, you've been accepted. I have to mention Pat Hoffey. Pat was a very influential teacher in Gordon's art career. Pat was the person on the panel, the interview panel, who thought that Gordon had more to say. The institution that did not accept him, we were told later, felt that Gordon had gone as far as he could.
Wow. That's
I mean, a
awesome.
mature age student, like he was 30, you know, life crises, and but to think that Pat saw something, because she is an artist and an educator and very intelligent and beautiful person, she saw that potential, and then she was also his teacher in painting, and so was able to just, you know, push him and promote his ideas, I guess is what I'm trying to say there.
Indeed.
Locally, of course, Gordon when he was at college, used to study Eugene.
Cochenzo,
Yes,
yeah.
and then you'd go to openings and you'd see Eugene's exhibitions, and it was like, oh, hopefully one day I could meet Eugene. You know? It's sort of like, you know, it's funny how you're just very humble, and you love the day that you can meet someone who's more important than you. And then from there, they struck up a great relationship and did a lot of collaborations, and that continued when we were living in France, and letters just exchanged, and lots of nice little artworks came out of that. You know, Andrew Anatopoulos, you know, like that whole idea of abstraction, because, you know, Gordon and Ian will probably touch on this, that he's always wanted to be an abstract artist.
Yeah, right.
But sort of got caught up in the narrative along the way. Along the long way. But did you want me to comment internationally? But I mean, Jimmy Durham, I mean, this is quite ironic in that we had struck up this conversation, as you know, at Documenta, came home, and then, you know, Josh, we had the conversation that we wanted to attempt a group show with Jimmy. And so the emails were sent, and Jimmy at the time was under pressure to do exhibitions, and his health wasn't very good. And he was having the heart issues. And then how ironic is that, you know, of the two, it was God that took the fall, you know. So, but yeah, love Jimmy's work and pursued it when we were over in Germany. There was a show on at one of the galleries over that way.
Yeah, let's stay overseas for a second. Conscious that we need to rattle through a bit here as well.
Sorry.
No, you're right, not at all. But you travelled and lived overseas on a couple of occasions, like the Epinay residency after the Mowat and Chandon Prize. And there was a trip to UK for the History and Memory show, Leanne McGregor's, that you alluded to earlier. So on some of these travels and trips, who were the artists or museums that Gordon sought out to look at closely? He really did zero in on a few people and institutions as being important to reflect on.
Yeah. Mental block. As a student, these important artists, overseas artists, you only saw them in textbooks. You know, so you just saw the flatness of the paintings, but the opportunity to spend 12 months in France and then to sort of venture out onto these journeys to Norway, to Germany in particular, enabled Gordon to see the actual original artwork. So I recall in 1990, we decided to go over to Amsterdam, to Holland, to view the Vincent van Gogh 100-year anniversary exhibition. We bought 3 tickets each, by the way. And it was standing room only. It was very uncomfortable, but, you know, we bought the catalogue, you know, etc. But during that time, like Gordon said, this is my first international trip. We are going to spend 1 month in the Netherlands. We are not going anywhere else. So there we left with our 1 bags on our backs and touring all the way around. So we went across to the Den Haag Museum, where he was able to come face to face with original Mondrian paintings, and to think that, you know, he thought Mondrian was this, you know, this god, and yet Mondrian wasn't even alarmed on the walls, you know, like Mondrian was a Dutch artist in the Netherlands. So I have to admit here that he did actually touch a Mondrian because he could.
There was another trip where we went to that GOMA museum as well, and I was standing with him as he was looking at, I think it was Broadway Boogie Woogie of Mondrian's, and he was like, holy shit, he's left the masking tape on it. That's awesome. So the fetish of pristineness that's happening, you know, almost around the corner with the suprematist works in other museums in Amsterdam, and this kind of messy technicality of Mondrian.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody knows like Gordon's a love of Van Gogh, Mondrian, Malevich. I mean, it appears in all of his works, but probably some of the more sort of discreet, for example, you know, and again, going back to always wanted to be an abstract artist. So the Scythe Wombly, the rawness of the scribbles, and that's even seen in some of the 1995 works on paper show it in GOMA. You know, Paul Klee, Joseph Beuys, Gerhard Richter, George Baslitz. I mean, they're all,
it's a roll call.
He loved the German artists, and so got an opportunity to see a lot of that through Bernard Luthi, who was a curator of the Arat Jarrah show, and who was just putting that show together when we just happened to be in France. So Bernard, you know, put us up in Dusseldorf and just took Gordon around everywhere. So, and that was really important, you know, and so, and that's why he's been able to put all of those elements in his work of retelling Australian history to sort of give that, even that global interaction, I guess.
Indeed. Abby Bernal writes a chapter in the Gordon, in the catalogue to accompany this show, about an almost opposite experience of equal importance, where you visited the Black USA exhibition in the Museum Over Holland. And I think Gordon makes the point in some notes or in his notebook, there's no lineups here, there's no crowds here. It's just, you know, the most important show I've ever seen. And so heroes for him emerge that he doesn't directly cite figuratively later on through the work, but as a conceptual building block, is almost set in stone right there, with looking at the incredibly important work of the African American flag by David Hammons, even Bill Treloar's work as well. So there were obviously some really important moments there. Leanne, we're going to, I think it'd be good to round out very quickly with the idea that Gordon sourced a lot of early imagery from school readers that he experienced in the 60s. There's an irony to the influence and legacy that he has, in that in his own time he was able to see his work enter the curriculum. You're a former educator and teacher, and I just wondered, what's your feelings or thoughts about what kids are introduced to in the classroom and how influential that is? It really sets a course for lifelong learning in my reading of things, but what's the practical experience out of a classroom?
Not being an art teacher, I'll just make that point right now, that I wasn't an art teacher, but I think sort of my experience, and even sort of, you know, through giving copyright to Gordon's images going into books that are used in schools, they are books. They are books that the kids got from the library, but I need to sort of do a plug here for the qagoma educational resource that should be available soon, is available now for all schools. It's activity based. It's a resource that will always remain fluid, that it can be used whether now into the future, it will never date. And it also looks at engaging not just learners who learn from looking at pictures and videos and documentaries, but also those kids that are sort of, you know, fidgety on their chairs and who have to go to art because there's no other option, because it's always put against science or, you know. So consequently, art can attract a lot of kids that they're a little bit lost. So this particular resource caters for those kids. That it's cards, and they can do things, and they can see pictures, and they can feel like they are part of the group, even if they're not being like. I just think of like a group work. There's always a leader, and there's always a scribe, and
it's really about self-discovery.
Yes,
yeah.
And so they get out of it what they can, and what they do. Yeah, so that's pretty much.
Thanks.
But it does engage on universal ideas in international artists as well as homegrown.
Awesome. Hey, Josh Milani, welcome. You worked with Peter Bellis, who's now obviously a retired dealer that first represented Gordon, and you began the transition from the gallery he founded into the Milani Gallery, probably I'd say around the middle phase of Gordon's career, but you're obviously aware of his work prior to that.
Yeah.
Your role in terms relative for this conversation, from my point of view, is really sort of threefold. It's about how to educate people to become art collectors. It's also about how to advocate a place in those collections for artists you represent. And it's in providing good counsel in the management of the estate in this case. Generally speaking, what are some of the key factors you or the art market regard as important in terms of valuing an artist's contribution?
Well, I think the position that I take, and this was partly something that I learned from Peter Bellis, was to begin with the cultural significance of the artist. And in Gordon's case, he was someone who was doing something completely new, really. He was an extremely intelligent person, and one of the smartest people I've ever met, in fact. And his cultural contribution was so kind of profound in the way that he was bringing together a kind of Western art history with Indigenous aesthetics, and in a way opened up a new language for art in the Australian context, which people like Tony have followed through with. But as a dealer, the artist has to really be making a cultural contribution first, I think. And then the kind of roots go down into the culture, as it were, and create something that's kind of part of the fabric of the cultural moment in which it's being made. And then one could say that the market and the curatorial discourse and the academic discourse around it follows from that. And, I've seen that with Gordon's career. Some extraordinary things happen in the last 10 or 12 years.
You talk about how an artist can actually, like Gordon, let's use the example, can sort of shift an institution or institutional thinking, or
yes,
whole rubrics around framing or representations, even which department in an institution might collect someone's work. So I guess there's an important role in all of that in your advocacy as well. And we'll follow through with that in a bit more depth with Ian. But in terms of how you represent an artist as an advocate or an emissary, it really does pay to understand the conditions of reception, the dynamics of different audiences, collecting policies, all of the gatekeepers and so forth. Can you expand on how you've been able to track Gordon's work going from, say, a local phenomenon to something more global? And what are the key markers along that journey, the debates, the exhibitions? I mean, we'll get to the Tate in a minute, but
sure.
Would just first to get a sense of the evolution there.
Well, you could say Gordon's work was kind of global from the beginning, and the global kind of art world is just catching up with him in a sense. He emerged at a moment in art history around 1989 where a lot of significant things were happening geopolitically. So you had the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you had the opening up of China, Tiananmen Square, you had locally, we just had the bicentennial celebrations, and Gordon was one of in the art world was kind of seen as a kind of major figure responding to that historical moment locally. And that moment in history, in a sense, was, one could argue, a turning point for art. They call it the postmodern era, but it was also the beginning of global contemporary art. And I think Gordon's actually one of the major figures in terms of First Nations art internationally. And that'll be, seen, that role will solidify over time as more scholars and thinkers come to his work.
Yeah. Sorry, Josh. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, in terms of the kind of shifts that came out of that institutionally, at the time he had, and this went to, this was before I got on the scene. Gordon had made it clear that he didn't want his work to be understood as Aboriginal art, and that was an issue of aesthetic equal rights. And I think he is one of the key advocates of what I would call aesthetic equal rights in art. In the late 20th century, anywhere in the world. And that's one of the most important things happening in art at the moment, I would say. But he basically wanted to be treated just as an artist, a contemporary artist. A white Australian artist isn't called an European Australian artist. Why should he be called an Aboriginal Australian artist? He was happy to be, he obviously wanted to be understood as having had that heritage, but he wanted to be treated equally. And in fact, I would say that, in some ways, he moved institutions by challenging their own internal departments, their collecting. I could have gone to some of the Indigenous curatorial departments of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the National Gallery of Australia, and found an easier path to his work being collected because they were perhaps more empathetic to the ideas. But we would always go through, contemporary art, and it forced them to think about their own policies. So now when you go to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, there's no segregation between Indigenous art and the rest of contemporary Australian art, nor should there be. And I think Gordon was one of the key figures who actually challenged institutions to think about their own internal collecting policies and their ways of displaying contemporary art. Indeed.
More recently, you were able to secure a pretty game-changing acquisition at the Tate through an international partnership. So what was involved there? What did they acquire, and what was it about Gordon Bennett's work that was central to their mission?
Well, very briefly, I think Gordon was really a key. He was the first artist that the Tate acquired under that program, which is a partnership with Quantum and the NCA. And it was very important that Gordon was the first because, in a way, he's a bridge between Western aesthetics and Indigenous aesthetics, and to be displaying, First Nations Australian art in an international context, having a kind of having Gordon Bennett as a kind of portal between these two cultures is amazing, because you could hang his work next to a Mondrian, and then you could have an Emily Ngware next to Gordon, and you would see a byline straight through those histories. You'd be able to pick up on the aesthetic cues that he was drawing on. And in a way, I would argue that perhaps his most significant legacy was, in fact, that bringing together those histories and teasing out all of the problematic kind of things around that. But in terms of the Tate acquisition, it was interesting. Francis Moritz, who's the director of the Tate, had actually organised a conference in 1993 at Tate Britain prior to the Tate Modern actually being established, and Gordon spoke at that. And Leanne McGregor was at that as well. And for the two of them, they said his speech was a life-changing experience, and it changed and challenged their ideas around what art is and what it could be. And at that time, no one had heard of him overseas, really. I mean, he was starting to develop an international profile, but it was very early days in that respect. Yeah. It led to Leanne McGregor doing the Icon show, which travelled from Brisbane to Birmingham, Copenhagen. It led to her she says it was instrumental in her choosing to come to Australia and take up the directorship of the MCA.
Yeah.
And many years later, when I was in Berlin supporting Gordon's work at the Berlin Biennale, Leanne McGregor invited me to dinner. She said, I'm going to have dinner with a friend, Francis, would you like to join me? And I didn't know who Francis was. And whilst we were sitting at the dinner table, Francis and I were enjoying a glass of wine and comparing notes on the art we'd viewed that day. And I said, oh, what have you enjoyed most out of the Berlin Biennale so far? And she said, I think the Gordon Bennett drawings are the outstanding works in the show. And she said, and Leanne McGregor said, oh, Francis, you should get something for your collection. And then Josh is the person to talk to. And I said, which collection do you represent? She said, oh, I'm the director of the Tate Modern. And I sort of thought, oh, I better slow down on the wine and take this seriously. But I called Leanne that evening and we had a conversation, and Gordon was involved as well. And I told them, I said, get out your best painting because the Tate want to buy a work, and it was amazing. And that work is now in their collection and it's hanging on their walls today as we speak.
Indeed. So just a quick spoiler alert for everybody at home watching this. We are going to go over time and shamelessly. Sorry, team. That's just causing internal meltdowns here. Josh, let's round out on your work in looking at a sustainable future for the estate and managing some of the impacts there. You've alluded to a few things there, but I want to pick up on one in particular, and that's the secondary market.
Yeah.
So it feels like after quite a while of grappling with how to categorize Gordon, the secondary market, auction houses really now seek to position him as a blue chip artist. But I recall the way there was pretty rocky over the last sort of 20, 25 years. Christie's would have a contemporary Australian art sale. Sotheby's would have an Aboriginal art sale. Another one would have a third category of contemporary and Aboriginal art. It was pretty, anyway, so recently there was a pretty amazing result at Sotheby's in New York. My question is, how does an auction house setting a record price affect the idea of an artist's stature, and how does it complicate the work that you're trying to do in driving a sustainable agenda going forward for the longevity of the estate and managing that legacy?
There's no real downside, I have to say, to the result in New York, which was quite an astonishing result. It was the work was acquired by a Swiss museum in Switzerland from Sotheby's, New York, and really, a result like that draws attention to Gordon's work in a market context. It doesn't necessarily mean that we then raise the price of everything. And I think something that Leanne has been, really fantastic in addressing is keeping his work affordable for people locally and punters that want to collect his work. You can still buy a print for, a little over $1,000. There's works at different price points. Obviously, the very major paintings are now, there's no more supply. They're limited, and we really need to manage very carefully how they're placed. So our goal really is for the major works that remain in the estate, and there are some really fantastic things there, to go to the right institutions. And personally, and I know Leanne shares this view, that we'd like to see some of those works end up in international collections, because not just because of what the financial benefit might be of that, it's really about the cultural legacy and the reach of his work. He does have an international audience now, it's growing. There are things that are happening internationally in relation to his work being curated into major international exhibitions. His letter to Jean-Michel Basquiat, which Tony referred to earlier, is being published in an anthology of artist writings alongside writings by his heroes, Vincent van Gogh, Malevich, writings by Mondrian, by Kandinsky, by Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. I mean, he's sort of being presented now as being part of this pantheon of the greats. And I think that will continue. The only other thing I'd say is that really, in terms of his market and the way that the auction houses treat him, to a certain extent, that's beyond our control. If the market is or if work's coming from the secondary market. However, generally speaking, we have very good relationships with those auction houses, and Leanne is able to determine the way that the work is presented and the manner in which it's presented. So in New York, in fact, a fantastic essay was written by Ian Mclean, who's, you know, one of the, if not the authority on Gordon's work. I think that helped contextualise intellectually the work in that context. And I expect to see a lot more of that in the future. And I think it's a good thing because it opens up the space for Australian art to be considered as part of an international art dialogue, but also an international art market. And I think that's going to grow into the future.
Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate your insights. Ian, thanks so much for hanging in there. Unfortunately, this is my first webinar, and it's proving that it's not such a spontaneous realm to jump in and out of. So I really appreciate you hanging in there. There's a lot that we've mentioned here, and I'm going to take a bit of a deeper dive on a few of those things with you. Let's start with the idea. I still think, I'm not sure still, that many people realise that Gordon wasn't able to have an Indigenous culture passed down from a family member. We mentioned his mum, Grace, who's a Birigubba Darumbal woman. Hello, if you're watching, Grace and Brad. She was essentially trained as a domesticated houseworker and dislocated from her parents whilst at the Cherbourg mission. And that really entrenched an intergenerational disruption from culture. It meant that Gordon had to forge new pathways to understand and express Aboriginality through non-traditional means and forms. There's a wonderful quote that he said, "You have to understand my position of having no designs or images or stories on which to draw to assert my Aboriginality. In just 3 generations, that heritage has been lost to me. Dots are my bridge to Aboriginality. They connect to their obvious relationship to the Western Desert paintings and in their relationship to photography and reproductions and representation, like the photographs of my mum and grandmother. I'm continually searching for ways to connect, to express my Aboriginality, and dots obsess me for now." A lot of questions come out of that, but they intersect really neatly with a lot of research that you've done for many decades. My question to you is, in deciding to sort of talk back to the hegemonic view of Aboriginal culture and history as structured by colonial discourse, using the language and imagery of Western canons and power structures, was Gordon Bennett the right man at the right time in Australia to be telling the right story to disrupt those sort of long-standing, convenient colonial narratives?
Geez, Simon, you ask such big questions. Well, I think most people in the art world would have to say yeah. You'd have to say yes to that question. And people, you know, I've been teaching in the university since the. In fact, I went through art school with Pat Hoffey. She was a couple of years ahead of me. I must say, Pat wrote the most fantastic obituary, I thought, to Gordon. Really moving.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'd been around in Queensland, art school in Queensland in the mid-70s. And I'd been deeply interested in Indigenous, not as much Indigenous art, but Indigenous politics, especially since before then, from growing up in Cairns, I think. Yeah. And I'd been wanting to, in my own writing, to sort of think about Indigenous art in a way that I thought I could in a meaningful way. And, you know, Trevor Nichols really interested me, who I see as a real precursor to Gordon in many ways. I know Gordon really admired Trevor's work, but when, you know, when Gordon came on the scene, it was sort of like, hallelujah, here's a person who's talking about all these things to do with colonial history, which I certainly felt strongly as a non-Indigenous person. But here was someone really talking about it as Trevor also did from an Indigenous perspective. And when I first met Gordon and Leanne in Melbourne when I was doing my PhD in 1993, I was just sort of, I'd actually seen his work before that too, but to sort of meet Gordon and then to see the work in a sort of much close up way, it did blow me away, especially getting to know Gordon. And you know, Gordon, as we've already heard, loved art school and deeply immersed himself in the discourse of art. I was going to say contemporary art, but not just contemporary art. And by the discourse, I mean both the writing and artworks, and of course that's where I come from, as well. And so I just you know, loved talking to Gordon, not just because he was an Indigenous artist, but because we could talk about all sorts of things, and so he definitely was the right person in the right time. I know Gordon sometimes worried about that.
Oh yeah.
You know, he worried that he was only being picked up because he was an Aboriginal artist working in a postmodernist art style. And the art world had been looking for that. You know, then Tracy came and then Gordon, and then it all took off, I guess from there. So there's a sort of a plus and a minus, I guess.
Indeed.
With that.
Gordon spoke about dots in that quote as being a kind of formative external legacy or an influence that he felt he needed to acknowledge but also address. And you see his referencing of dots from quite an interesting perspective as well. How did he deploy dots to kind of speak back?
Well, you know, I think Gordon liked dots because they were what you were talking about before, Simon. They are actually a artistic device that connects cultures. Virtually every culture uses dots, and of course, because of Western desert painting becoming so big in the 80s, it became a sort of trademark of Indigenous art. But Gordon knew that that many other cultures or many other artists use dots, and I think it was a thing that was talked about in postmodernism about the dot screen. And Gordon was trained to be a postmodernist artist. He went through art school at the height of postmodernism, and those sort of texts that talked about the dot screen technology. So I think that's why dots were very important to him. They could they echoed so many different sort of language systems, and Gordon was really interested in language systems.
Indeed.
Not just words, but how words were structured. So he's interested in the alphabet. He's interested in perspective. He's interested in dotting. He's interested in Jackson Pollock's all over things, as if they're all different languages. And of course, languages just always resonate. The great thing about languages is they can be translated. This is something Walter Benjamin talked about. So every language resonates with every other language, and Gordon is this, you know, as you said, this great sort of connecting force that sort of runs through what Australian art might be, and I think not just Australian art, but you know, world art.
Yeah. When we think of legacy and influence, which is really a question around reception as well, maybe another important parallel question out of that isn't how he would come to think of himself and his own identity, but how that relates to the reception of his work. That is the creation of his social and reputational identity in the art world, and even beyond that. As we know from the outset, he really refused to be labelled. He had a particular disdain for the label urban Aboriginal artist. And it was clearly, as Josh was saying and Tony earlier, a public attempt at avoiding kind of limiting, essentialist categorizations, but it was also a personal desire not to be overwhelmed or to engage with the definitions of others. So there was the various responses of adopting a silence as a kind of deliberate performative strategy from 94, years of non-speaking. He adopted the nom de plume John Citizen. Do you think all of that or any of that worked for him in being able to escape or disengage from the pressure he felt? Or do you think it kind of, in some instances, upped the ante for people who were either unaware that that's a legitimate position or had deliberately ignored it in a bid to fit him in the box for the sake of their own argument, or even to argue that he was somehow less authentic, as if the only real art was dot painting?
You know, Gordon said many things to me that sort of made me think twice. You know, they're sort of revelatory, and one of them is must have been in the mid-90s, and he was just going through showing me photographs of his previous work, and I wanted to talk to him about self-portraiture. You know, from that cliche that every painting is a self-portrait. And I said, you did so many self-portraits. So he quickly flipped over and showed me this self-portrait called Requiem for a Self-Portrait, which is an abstract painting painted when he was a student. And he said to me, my self-portraits are not self-portraits. Just because they're called self-portrait, don't limit them to self-portrait. And so I think he was really seeing himself as sort of channeling so many different voices, and the John Citizen, I think, is about that. And that's when he said to me, when he showed me that painting, that I've always wanted to just be an abstract painter, you know. And here's my abstract painting from 1998. And I guess abstraction is the perfect escape route, isn't it, from all those identities that people want to put on you. And I know that when he first went into his so-called abstract series, he certainly talked about it like that to me anyway, as a way to escape what someone called the burden of representation.
Yeah.
You know, that was upon him. But of course, once he got there, you know, Gordon found it wasn't an escape route.
Indeed.
And right to the end, Gordon was always, to me, he always had a lot of self-doubt, which I found difficult to understand given how successful he was. And so, you know, when he went into abstract art, and a lot of people found that very difficult to deal with because his work was so figuratively driven. And, you know, what's this about? He didn't just sort of give it up. He pursued it for several years to the, you know, well, he was still pursuing it when he passed away.
I mean, he spoke to me very around that time as having been very conscious of someone like Philip Guston's previous career being based around abstraction that then suddenly swung into figuration, and the freedom or the liberty that doing something that nobody expects you should be doing gave him. But I suspect that freedom, that sense of freedom, didn't last that long.
Yes, well, as I'm sure you're all aware of, when people look at abstract art, they start seeing things there. That's how the human mind works. And you might think you're escaping it, but then you start seeing things. And of course, the way, well, like the painting on the screen now, which has that Jackson Pollock, or this one here, there's Jackson Pollock abstraction under it. You know, Gordon is such a great artist at evoking so many different sorts of meanings in a work. You know, there's an explosion of meaning. There's no one meaning in his work at all. I think there's always an explosion of different meanings in there. And you know, I mean, the reason Gordon's work is so powerful is because he was always a great abstract artist. He's just such a great sense of design. He knows how to place things on a canvas and bring it alive. And so, you know, really, it's not to be unexpected. But, you know, and now I think his abstract work just fits in really well with his whole oeuvre. You start to see abstract things happening in much earlier work.
Absolutely.
You know, so he sort of. I remember when I first got to know Gordon when he was doing his amazing. He was just amazingly energetic and productive in that first half of the 90s. And every work was just sort of amazing. And then suddenly he changed style and, you know, went to the home decor series. And I said, Gordon, why have you changed style? I love that. I love that earlier work. I don't think this series is as good, you know, it's not going to. And it was sort of like you're always having to catch up with him. You'll probably just have similar stories, Leanne, and I'm sure Simon too, who's known Gordon closer than I have.
And that happens with every series.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and for Gordon, it wasn't about making a sale either. It was about getting the stuff out on the canvas to get it all out. You know, I mean, as you can see with the Stripe series, it lasted like, what, 5 or 6 years. You know, it was about, you know, doing what he wanted to do, about having that freedom to do what he wanted to do and not be dictated by, you know, what was going on in politics even, because I mean, initially it was a self-therapy career, you know, what do you call it? The self-therapy exercise,
Yeah, he sort of knew when he'd come to an end of a series, didn't he? I remember having a long conversation with him once. He didn't know what to do next, you know.
And then there'd be an election.
Yes. In fact, I have a theory that you could write a biography of Gordon's work based on Australian elections and
electoral cycles.
Which party won, you know.
Hey, so just that's an interesting point, because on those junctures, there usually sort of rose up a wave of response in mainstream media. Mainly, I got a sense that when Gordon did read those sorts of reviews and there was some sort of critique, I felt he read that more directed at him personally rather than at the actual painting or within art historical terms. This question is for you, Ian, as a writer, scholar, reviewer. How conscious are you as a kind of legacy maker that what you write today not only affects the maker, but stands through time to be read in the future? What are the ethics involved there?
Oh gosh, Simon.
25 words or less, no pressure.
In 10 seconds.
Well, look, you know, for me as an art historian, Gordon was a godsend, because I could think through a lot of things I hadn't thought through, because there wasn't the right artist to think through it. But he was a godsend because I could sort of write about things that I sort of wanted to write but didn't know how to articulate. That his works, in thinking and talking about his works, you know, showed me how to articulate. And I you know, someone said that every art historian needs their artist. You know, needs to find an artist to in a way I guess articulate what they want to say, and Gordon was certainly, you know, that for me. I just worry that I've written too much about Gordon. I think I've said this to Leanne, you know, he needs a lot more voices, because Gordon's work is much bigger than, you know, I know one of the reasons Gordon, you know, I know there were personal reasons why Gordon didn't really want to talk about his work. You know, as Tony said, you know, he was a sort of shy person. But the other reason he didn't want to talk about his work is that he didn't want to limit the meaning of his work. As soon as an artist opens their mouth about their work, people think that's what the work's about. And but as we know, a work only lives because it starts to accumulate meaning from, you know, through time and through what other people say about it. And I think that was another reason Gordon was reluctant to talk about his work, because he is obviously as the artist, the authority on the work. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your work, but art historians, as an art historian, you know, you're always looking for an artist you can speak through, who's in a way a mirror for your ideas. And just as Gordon did exactly the same with artists and also writers, you know, they were like a mirror for him to just to see what he wanted to see. Yeah.
I know we've gone well over. I've got one more for you and then we'll wrap it up. You mentioned before that you sort of come to this project with an early interest in the politics or Indigenous or nationalist politics involving Indigenous histories. Right now, in a day when we're waiting for a big decision in the United States, when the world seems in the midst of this really great tussle between, say, a bristling right-wing nationalist sentiment underpinned by populism and individualism against maybe a centrist or progressive aspirations for inclusivity and diversity, does the fact that Gordon Bennett's practice could still speak eloquently to both of those apparent sides of a debate revitalise Gordon as possibly radically apolitical?
Oh, gee, that's a thought I would never have had. It's a very interesting thought. I mean, as you know, Simon, Gordon was intensely political.
Yeah.
In terms of local politics and global politics, and does his work. You know, I think I can see what you're getting at, because he is wanting his work to be a well, let's say a mirror, since we use that metaphor before, which different people can look into and start to see ways to talk to each other.
Mm.
You know, I know once Gordon said to me, he doesn't understand why every artist in Australia isn't talking about Australia's colonial history. It's the elephant in the room. Every artist should be making work.
Yeah.
You know, about these things. And he I think it's the quote on the catalogue on the back cover there. He did have this, I don't want to call him a missionary, but he had a mission to change the world.
Yeah, he did.
For the better, just in terms of what you were saying there.
Yeah.
And I mean, the person that I, you know, as Tony talked about, in fact, when I first met Tony, it would have been ages ago. Tony probably can't even remember. Really early in his career, I think it might have been in Cairns, but we got talking somehow, and he just wanted to talk about Gordon Bennett. So, all those things Tony was saying there is I know from the heart. It just sort of all came out again. But the person that really changed my life was Kath Walker, which is how I knew her back in the early 70s. She used to run a sort of open house she was really interested in educating. I was a teenager, but an open house for kids and teenagers. I think the things that happened, I went over there several times, you know, that's what changed my life and made me then receptive to what Gordon was doing, 20 years later. And I guess everyone has a story like that, you know, in their life, but it was certainly Gordon's bringing together of art and politics that resonated with me, because that's what I was trying to do myself in my own, you know, career as an art historian.
Indeed. In tying all of this up, I think one of the messages that comes out loudly from this panel is that maybe what propels an artist's legacy is, in a sense, that uncanny way a practice of historical significance can be made fresh sense of in the current moment. Maybe a better way of saying that is that the critical art of the future will be an art that made sense at the time of its making, but that makes sense of time to come. Gordon's prescience in describing frontier violence or the corrosive use of language and excluding certain people as a lived experience being lived today obviously speaks to an enduring Australian condition and our inability to reconcile that past. But it also now connects us and him more than ever with global trajectories like Black Lives Matter, even Me Too and the way it calls out toxic culture, or even the way minority cultures are still constantly exotified or framed for the consumption of mainstream coercion. It's clear the business and purpose of Gordon Bennett's project remains unfinished business, and that's something only we might act on. My question for you at home is, can you see a time when the dial has moved to a more informed and balanced place where coexistence in the accommodation of multiple views and voices is commonplace? What would that place look like to you?